Hello there, and hi, and welcome to another interesting presentation. So, now we're going to hear about cloud native culture, what that is, and why you should care about. And I'm very happy to be here with Nate Schutta. And without any more further talking, Nate, please start it off. The stage is yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Sebastian. So my name is Nate Schutta. I work for VMware. Best way to describe me, frankly, is architect as a service. Somebody called me that a few years ago because, in the pre-pandemic times, I'd go places and talk to people. Now I just basically sit in my office and talk to people, or at least stare at a screen and talk to people. I assume there's people on the other end. But, I thought that was actually pretty fitting, architect as a service, although I will admit I sounded the acronym out in my head and realized it may not have been intended exactly as a compliment. So, I don't know. It is what it is, I guess. But anyhow, well, I guess without further ado, we can just go dive in and I'll see what kind of trouble this gets us into. And hopefully everybody finds talking about culture interesting. I know in technology, we get very fixated on solving technical problems, and we forget that the people thing are a pretty big part of this equation. And I know I kind of got into technology because I wasn't very good at the whole politics and people issue stuff. And then I got into technology and realized you can't escape people and culture issues. So that's a little bit about what we'll hammer on today. At least that's my plan anyway. So, all right. Well, what do you think, Sebastian? Should we kick into some slides and see what kind of trouble I can get into here for the next hour?
See what we can learn about culture as introvert programmers, right?
Oh, I know. I mean, I considered myself an introvert for probably the first 25 years of my life. And I was on a project and somebody said to me, "Oh, no, you're an extrovert." I said, "Oh, I think you're mistaken." And I guess I'm probably an extrovert now, or at least, as extroverted as one gets in the technology space. But, for each their own. But
yeah, looking forward.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Sebastian. Well, let me hit play on this old slide share here and see what happens. And theoretically, that should be full screen now. At least that's the rumor. I don't know. I guess we'll find out. It's funny. I always used to say when we do these things live, if you can't hear me, let me know. But of course, if you can't hear me, you can't hear that question to respond to me. And so, it's always a little bit of a leap of faith that I assume this is all working. But all right, let's dive into this. Now, a couple little report things you might be interested in if you find what I talk about interesting. I did this Thinking Architecturally ebook a few years ago. It sort of was my thinking around architecture and what does it mean to be an architect? Really, what does it mean to be in charge of technical change in an organization? Because that's really what we do an awful lot of, is how do we shift, from one approach, one technology to another. That happens constantly throughout our experience as technologists. I also put together this report around microservices. If you're in the cloud space, there's a guarantee pretty much that you're doing microservices in some way, shape, or form. It's just sort of my thoughts around when we should use microservices based on some work that I did with clients a few years back. And that's morphed around into this report ultimately here now. Well, let's talk about the cloud, shall we? Now, I've been in this space for several years, and you realize pretty quickly there's a lot of options when it comes to cloud. We could do microservices, we could do modular monoliths, put a whole bunch of stuff in containers, or maybe we'll just do serverless, and then we don't have to worry about that at all. I love the name serverless. It's like, well, they're still servers, just we're not responsible for them. And, everything, of course, today is as a service. That's kind of my running joke. Hey, if only we had blank as a service, et cetera, et cetera. And we're all starting to kind of grapple with, well, should we be polycloud? Do we need to be in multiple providers? Do we need some hybrid on-prem, off-prem kind of thing? And as engineers, it can kind of make your head spin and like, well, how do I make sense of all this? Because as much as I wish, there was just some magic fairy dust that I could spread around all these projects and they would all just be successful, there are real engineering issues here. And there are no such thing as magic sparkle ponies. I'm sorry. It'd be kind of cool if there were. The biggest challenge I see, frankly, in transitioning to the cloud, and I this is just an instance of technology change. It's not the first one I've seen in my career. It's not the first one you've seen in your career. Certainly won't be the last. We lose sight of the fact that it isn't just technology that's changing. We're also changing our organization. We're changing the culture that our organization is sort of steeped in, and we have to think about that. What does that mean to change that culture? And so we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that today. And I know for a lot of technologists, it's like, whoa, culture, like, why do we want to talk about culture? That has nothing to do with technology. I'm in this space because I want to just deal with, technology, and I want to deal with messy people. Well, here's the reality. You get 3 people in a room and you got people problems. It's just the nature of the beast. And, you ignore culture at your own peril. I didn't always understand this. There was one point in my career where I tried to bring GitHub Enterprise into an organization. And, my friend and I that tried to do it, we were real cute. We put together a gist on why we should use GitHub. And so we thought, well, this is so obvious. Everyone's just going to do this. And what we didn't take into account is the subversion administrator sort of team will their antibodies activated as soon as we attempted to challenge their fiefdom. That's not the way we looked at it. We weren't saying we should replace necessarily. We wanted people to have the option. And, we just didn't quite understand the politics of that. Now, every company has a culture, yours, mine, et cetera. And the challenge for many of us as technologists is understanding, like, what is your culture like? Now, I didn't always appreciate this, but I had this conversation several years ago with my then manager, and I'm sure, complaining about something taking too long. Why aren't we adopting this approach or this technology, whatever it was? And my manager said to me, Nate, what do you think the paint color was here when I interviewed 5 years ago? What did the walls look like? I said, I have no idea, Jeff. And he said, Nate, exact same as they are today, same color. And I said, I don't understand what you're trying to tell me here, Obi-Wan Kenobi. And he said, Nate, if they don't change the paint once in a while just to change the paint, you're at a company that doesn't like change. It says, we will get to the right answer. We just might not get there as quickly as you want us to. The challenge for us is culture is something that happens far before we ever get involved. Unless it's a startup. If it's your own startup, then hey, guess what? You get the opportunity to put your stamp directly on the culture of that company. But organizations hire, attract, and retain based on culture. We talk an awful lot about culture fit when we're going through a hiring cycle, trying to get our heads wrapped around, well, what makes sense for us? Or are we a good fit? Are you going to get along here? I remember very early on, I think it was my very first job out of university, our CIO gave this presentation to all the new hires saying, just so everybody's, clear, we're not a technology company. We just spend $1 billion on technology a year. Oh, okay. And his point was, if you're looking for that kind of experience, go to a startup. Here we're just a cost center. We're here to assist the business. So just make sure you're going into this eyes wide open. The reality is, culture informs everything we do, in small ways, in large ways. And one of the ways that I experienced this in my career was the battle over jeans in a previous company I worked in. The moral of the story in that organization is the head of HR hated jeans. He was on record as saying, I went to college and got an MBA, so I'd never have to wear jeans again. And so the idea of people wearing jeans in the office, this just made his head spin. And so there was, I think it was a 6-week period for 1 day a week you could wear jeans. And it was only if you donated to some charity that the company supported. And then you could get these stickers that you technically were supposed to wear while you were wearing jeans. And anybody that wore jeans any other time of the year, this was like, oh my God, such a huge, huge problem. And so that was the model that I had for that organization. And then several years later, I was actually back at the company for a friend's retirement party. And I walk in and look around, and like half the room's wearing jeans. And so I look at my buddy, I'm like, well, what happened here, John? And he said, oh, well, the head of HR, remember that guy? Yeah, he retired. The very next day, the CEO sent out an email saying, dress for the day. In other words, if you want to wear jeans, wear jeans. And I thought, well, that's fascinating. The moral of the story is, culture is where good ideas go to die. And I can tell you from direct experience, it's really hard to change, because people who have risen to power or excelled in an organization, in a lot of situations, it's because they figured out how to game that culture. And as soon as someone like me comes along and tries to change that, the antibodies react. And it's like, oh, hey, this is a threat to my position, to my power. I don't like that, so I'm going to eliminate that threat. A friend of mine refers to this as the middle management mafia. He did a lot of work in one organization that he could directly show was translating to like 7 digits to the bottom line. This was not some, well, if I squint and if we make a bunch of, it's like, no, this is directly leading to sales. So the grassroots people loved it. The development staff, the engineers thought it was amazing. The top level management loved it as well, because they were seeing this flow to the bottom line. It was the middle management that's like, oh, hey, this is threatening my fiefdom. This is threatening my organization. I don't like that. And I'm going to do everything in my power to shut it down. The most dangerous phrase, the most dangerous 6 words you can utter in any organization is, that's how we've always done it. A few years back, I was doing some work for a client, and they had a performance issue. And so I was brought in to try to help figure out like what's going on. Is there something else we can do architecturally? And so just, kind of miscellaneously understand how this company worked. They basically had a bunch of clients. The clients had boxes of widgets, and then they processed the widgets. And when they started, they only had a few clients with a few boxes of widgets. And so they just did it as an overnight batch run, and it easily completed overnight. And well, then darn it, they got successful, and they got more and more clients and more boxes of widgets and bigger boxes of widgets. And all of a sudden that processing, it's not finishing overnight anymore. And so they're walking me through the architecture, and I asked what I thought was a pretty basic question. I said, well, does the processing of widget A, does that have any impact on the processing of widget B? No, not at all. I mean, we do some aggregation at the end. Okay, so could you process widget A and widget B in parallel? And there was sort of this very pregnant pause, and you could kind of see the light bulb go on, and it's like, yeah, we could totally do that. And it's like this big aha moment. Now, I'd like to think I'm kind of good at software. I've been doing this a long time, but I didn't have the baggage of that's how we've always done it, forcing me into this preconceived notion of the only way we could do it. Now, there's this fantastic Upton Sinclair quote: "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it." We have to keep that in mind too. When we're trying to do any kind of technology change, this is going to crop up in ways large and small. Also important to remember your Machiavelli. The innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old, and lukewarm defenders and those who may do well under the new. Now, there's been a lot of great pieces written about culture. This is one of my favorites. This is from Stratechery. This is Ben Thompson, or Stratechery, depending on the day of the week. And he talks about the curse of culture. And he did this, he was talking about like Apple and Microsoft and others. And he makes this really poignant, statement. Culture is one of the company's most powerful assets, right until it isn't. If we think about Microsoft, their big driving thing was Windows, and they sort of kind of missed out on, well, things are moving to the cloud. Now, kudos to them. They've done a 180, under some really great management, and they're doing some amazing work. But we've seen this before. Like Intel was all about making chips for big computers, and that was their whole thing. And then it kind of missed out on mobile. They're trying to retrench. So culture is one of our most powerful assets until it isn't. So we have to be aware of our culture. And changing it is hard, and so the best way I can explain how you change culture is yet another quote, this one from Hemingway. How did you go bankrupt? Well, two ways: gradually, then suddenly. And that's basically what happens when we try to change culture. It can be done, I assure you. It takes time. It takes patience. I'm not good at that part. Sorry. And it isn't just about buying a tool. I wish it was. This would make it so much easier for us as technologists. Here, just buy this thing and our problems are solved. So I love this tweet: periodic reminder, you're not going to Jira your way to culture change. And something to be said for that. Of course, my friend Matt Stein had a wonderful tweet earlier this year. Innovation does not mean using a new language, framework, or technology. It'd be kind of nice if it was, but that's just not all that is part of this equation. So I've gone through this before, and one of the most powerful sort of culture shifts I saw was in an organization shift to agile development methodologies away from traditional waterfall. And it started with a really simple ask: hey, we need some project rooms. And our facilities people kind of shot back, what's a project room? And so we explained it to them, and this is what we're looking for. We're going to have all the developers in one room together and blah, blah, blah. And they're like, whoa, you misunderstand. That's not what we do here. We just place people efficiently in felt line boxes. And like, okay, well, that's not what we want to do. And so we pestered them, and we pestered them, and we pestered them, and they finally relented. But they gave us the worst conference room you can possibly imagine, one that no one ever booked out unless they literally had no other choice. That's why they gave it to us. It was interior. There were no windows. Now, the one advantage of this room is if, I don't know, a tornado hit the building, we would be the last to know, because we were pretty sheltered right and almost in the middle of the building. We didn't have cell signal. You had to go out in the hallway if you needed to make a call or check your phone or something. And we had no idea what the weather was. So you go in the morning, especially like as winter approaches, you go in and it's dark, you leave, it's dark. It wasn't great. So it was a little bit of getting adjusted as a project team. But you know what? It was a start. And so we started there, and we showed some success. We built credibility, and that served then as a model for what we wanted in future project rooms. And so, again, we kept kind of working with them, pestering them, and it grew from there. In fact, at one point, our facilities people kind of really got into this, and we were working on building out some new project rooms. They're like, well, we could knock down this wall, and we could put up a whiteboard wall if you could make it glass, and you could draw on it. I mean, and they started getting kind of fired up because it's like, wow, you're finally asking me to do something other than efficiently placed felt line boxes. Now, what was really interesting to me is as I left this organization, as I was transitioning out, that we were in the process of converting all of the IT floors to project rooms. And different sizes, small ones, medium ones, large ones, et cetera. But it wasn't even a question anymore. Just, well, of course, this is what we're going to do. The challenge, of course, is this isn't something where we waved a magic wand on Tuesday and by Thursday it was done. It took time, and it took a lot of persistence and a lot of poking and asking and poking. Now, it's a lot easier if you are the decision maker, if you are in charge. There's this great piece that came out several years ago, thanks to someone inadvertently setting the privacy setting on their Google Plus thing wrong. And it was about the Bezos Mandate. And so it's talking about basically what Google does well, what Amazon does well, what Google can learn from Amazon, et cetera. And so Bezos at some point put out this decree to the development staff. Listen, all data is going to go through a public API, period, full stop. These services are going to be the communication method between teams, period, full stop. No other form of communication, no direct reads, no links, no backdoors, et cetera. Oh, and by the way, all of these APIs must be designed to be public, no exceptions. Now, that doesn't mean all of them will be released publicly, but we have to think in terms of them eventually being public. Now, of course, he did give the out. If you don't want to do this, that's fine, you're fired. Now, as you can likely surmise, developers reacted to that incentive and things started to change. You probably don't have that level of clout in your organization, so probably aren't going to be able to just put out your own mandate and make things happen. But there are some approaches that you can leverage to start making things move. So you've probably heard Adrian's discussion about Netflix, and there was this thing where we don't have all your superstar engineers, and what I love about this is he said, well, you understand that we hired them away from you and got out of their way. But I think the more interesting piece of his article is this line right here. You don't add innovation to a culture, you get out of its way. And that can be really challenging for a lot of companies to actually be able to step back and say, all right, this is going to happen, and I'm not going to be the one telling people what to do. It's going to arrive more organically. But that's what we have to be willing to do, get out of the way of innovation. And there's other ways of doing this through design and things of that nature. And to be honest, sometimes the easiest thing to do is just start with a whole new culture. I've seen this a lot. Companies will have a lab set up somewhere. It could be on a special floor. It could be in a different building. Some organizations go so far as to essentially spin out a whole nother organization, a whole nother company even, that's wholly separate, has a different, P&L sheet and the whole 9 yards. I've seen that a couple times, but it's very common to have an organization at least that doesn't have to play by the same set of rules. I saw this in one case where you even needed to have special badge access just to get onto their space. They had their own building on campus, and not everybody could get in there. And they were adopting a lot of the sort of startup-like ideas. There were snacks and there was a beer tap and things of that nature, but it didn't follow all the typical constraints of sort of the existing organization. Now, the beauty here is it allows you to start fresh, and it allows you to sort of self-select for the like-minded individuals. These are people who want this to work. They're invested in making it work. It isn't a bunch of people you're dragging into this who are going to push back and dig in their heels. So that's a very common way to make this happen. We also need to understand our org structure is probably hurting us here, especially when it comes to these distributed applications. By now everybody's familiar with Conway's law, which it's probably older than many of us here. This came back in the late 60s, where he basically said, an organization designs systems that are basically a copy of their org chart. And so for us trying to build these distributed architectures, like, well, hang on, I'm trying to create a series of small isolated services, but how do I do that if my organization isn't a set of small isolated teams? Well, inverse Conway's law, or the Conway sort of inverse Conway maneuver, where, well, let's evolve the team towards the architectural end state that we actually want. Now, that does lead to some interesting outcomes. My teams are siloed, but my microservices have to talk to one another. They have to work together to accomplish these business goals. So how do I get people to work together effectively, especially if my incentives and yours aren't aligned? How do I build out infrastructure when I've got a bunch of different teams pulling potentially in different directions? They might want to use different stuff. How do I staff up an operations team for these kinds of scenarios? We can't be in a situation where apps and ops is a one-to-one sort of relationship. We need a lot fewer operators for a lot more application folks. And now, in fairness, the VP of ops might have some different thoughts around that particular piece of the equation, but it does force us to adopt this you build it, you own it sort of approach, that accountability that comes along with the autonomy that these architectures give us. So we have to be willing to do pager duty. I can't just say that's Ops's problem. I'm just going to pitch it over the wall. Hey, works on my box, must be fine. The moral of the story is it's fairly easy. I shouldn't say fairly. I mean, it's comparatively easy to change technology. That's not the hardest part of this equation. It's changing the culture that we tend to miss and is so vital for us in being successful as we try to make these switches to sort of these cloud native approaches. Now, cloud native gives us some really interesting capabilities, right? We can scale up, we can scale down. I can do that all on demand. I've got limitless compute with a really big asterisk next to it. Additional fees may apply. And unfortunately, those fees can be kind of opaque. I love these tweets. I've been paying Amazon 80 cents a month, so I spent an hour searching through the console. I'm pretty sure I turned everything off or deleted things I wasn't using, and dang it, I got a bill for 23 cents. It's the Hotel California. You can check in, but you can't ever check out. And I love this one too. I was looking at the simple cost calculator, and I really love to know where the complex calculator is and how many dedicated EC2 instances do I need to actually run a browser that can display it. So I just, for fun, took a peek at that and said, all right, what's going on here? And yeah, there's a lot of things you can turn on. This isn't new. This has always been there. It's just we as developers, well, we had kind of this layer of indirection between us and the cost. We had our infrastructure people to solve this for us. We could basically say, I need something about this big, and they'd go, okay, and they would turn on all the right things, and they would figure out how much, and they knew how to do it efficiently. This is, to a certain extent, the consequence of democratizing technology. I now have direct access to this. I have the ability to turn things on. I may not know the most cost-effective way to do that. And so it's on us, really, to be more thoughtful about that and probably get some advice from people who know it a little better than us. This one made me laugh. We dropped our cloud cost by 61% in 2 hours by the novel strategy of looking at our bill and turning off things we weren't using. We have the same kind of thing happening in our lives. There's all these subscription services that so many of us have now, and everything's a streaming service, and it's very easy to sign up for one because you want to watch this show or this movie or something, and then you kind of forget about it, and then 6 months later, you're like, why am I paying all this money? Oh, okay, I could probably go in and turn some of those off. Now, it's important to understand that cloud native isn't just this architectural pattern. It's this interesting combination of practices and techniques and technologies. There's going to be a dash of agile development and some continuous delivery. There's going to be a heavy dose of automation. We'll talk more about that here in a minute. Going to put some things in some containers, maybe do some microservices, some functions. But again, it's the change to our culture that we need to be very, very aware of. We're going to have to adopt some flavor of DevOps and just understand that infrastructure is a hugely different game today than it was in the past. And this is probably the biggest shift I've seen in my technology career. When I started, our servers were this bespoke kind of thing. They were homegrown. We built them by hand. It was like artisanal coffee, and we gave them pithy names. I worked at one organization where all our servers were named after Simpsons characters. A friend of mine said they named all theirs after Marvel characters, and we quite frankly treated them like pets. These are my cats. That's Han in the front, Chewie in the back. They're floating around here somewhere. Chewie was actually involved in the pre-show, and I'm a little surprised one or both of them hasn't decided to bomb. And they really like pair presenting with me. I think there's actually a decent chance, between the two of them, they probably could deliver a fair amount of my presentations at this point in the pandemic. The moral of the story is these two little critters are basically members of the family, and I'll do pretty much whatever it takes to keep them happy and healthy. And we used to do that with servers too. And of course, in this era of software, servers were this really heavily constrained resource. They were very, very expensive. And so our bean counter said, hey, you guys got to get your money's worth out of that. So can't just put one app on there. We got to do something better. And thus was born the app server. Let's put as many apps as possible on that server so we can maximize the ROI. Now, the downside here, there's some unintended side effects. There's always unintended side effects. Well, now I've got shared resources. which means one application's bug can take down multiple applications. Coordinating changes across these things can be a total pain in the keister. I'm sorry, you can't have nice things because the Wombat app's not ready. I cannot tell you how many months, years I've spent stuck on outdated things because we're waiting for a big, slow plotting application to move and they won't move because reasons. I've done these currency projects. They're horrible. It's this 18-month slog of freezes and testing and frustration, and it's just boring. And it's not fun for the customers. It's not fun for us. And I think this is why a lot of organizations sort of kick the can down the street. They're like, oh, no, we're not going to deal with currency. That's not worth it. Besides, I'm going to be promoted before it becomes an issue. It'll be somebody else's problem. And made me think of this Yoda quote, fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. Who knew there was such a thing as Yoda ops? Now, of course, during this era of software, we are moving code from one instance of an app server to another instance of an app server, which means, well, it worked in dev, but not in test. And then you pound your head against the table and you're like, but why not? I was assured the environments were the same. I remember one particular instance where we ran into this and we were beating our heads against the table for a couple of weeks. And then we discovered that, well, the app servers were at the same level, but the patches were applied in a different order. And that's why it didn't work here. And this is where you start to question your life choices. And you're like, is there another way to make a living? How else can I make a living? Is it too late to change careers? But things have changed. Things have shifted. Servers are commodities now. And so with Linux and Intel chips replacing these sort of custom operating systems, these custom chips, we're in this position now where that's kind of the dominant computing platform. I think if you would have told me when I was in college that we'd all be interacting with Unix devices in our phones and talking to Unix devices on the web, I'd be like, what's the web? And it would be kind of hard for me to get my head wrapped around. But this is one of my other all-time favorite tweets. What are clouds made of? Linux servers, mostly. Kind of crazy. Now, the outcome of that, of course, is prices have dropped, and it turns out that servers are no longer the constraining factor. People costs, long since eclipsed hardware costs, but as things like Heroku and App Engine and Cloud Foundry and whatnot came along, we started to realize that shared servers are really a liability, and we need to treat them like cows. And when they get sick, we just get a new instance as opposed to spending days trying to track down the problem. If you've ever been on a large scale cattle operation, they typically don't give the cows names, they give them numbers. And no offense to number 15 here, but if number 15 gets sick, there's a limit to what we're going to do before we just get a new instance of 15. This gives us a whole new set of abstractions. And so we've got, containers, we've got platforms, and what it allows us to do is just package the app up with everything it needs. And we move that from one environment to another. In fact, we're probably not moving anything at all. We're just changing a routing table ultimately. And so if it works in dev, guess what? It's going to work in test because it's the same thing. Huge amount of win for us. Now, as a development team, this is great because if I want to upgrade or I need to add this library, I'm free to do that. I'm not impacting anyone else. Now, why that's important to us? Well, it moves the value line. It gets us out of doing this undifferentiated heavy lifting. As my former boss, Andrew Clay Schaefer, likes to say, hey, good job configuring servers this year, said no CEO ever. Important work, but not the kind of thing that's going to move the proverbial needle. So this changes our development model. It allows us to embrace this always be changing mantra, run experiments, do A/B tests, be much more responsive to our business partners. And it really allows us to turn changes around in days or weeks, not months or years. And that's a really important place for us to be. The first spring one I attended as an employee, a gentleman from Scotiabank got up and talked about their journey. And this was a multi-month process, multi-year process, really, from the traditional quarterly releases to doing thousands of deploys a month. And to be, again, very clear, this does not happen overnight. This is not something you decide to do, on Monday and it's all working by Thursday. It just doesn't work that way. What was really interesting to me is a bunch of my former colleagues were at this event. We were chatting in the hallway, and one of my friends said, oh, Nate, we can never do that. I said, why not? He said, well, you worked with us for years. We can't make that change. I said, well, Scotiabank did, and they're a bank. Banks are pretty conservative. So if a bank can do it, I'm pretty confident you can too. Now, whether it's convenient or not, speed matters today. Disruption's impacting all of us. No industry is immune. I'm sorry. Amazon Prime basically says, guess what? I can order my food directly from Whole Foods. So even though you're a grocery store, yeah, you kind of need to be a technology company. And, you know, a lot of insurance companies look at Google as a competitor. And, you know, again, convenient or not, we're all technology companies today. This is probably the encapsulation of the shift that I've seen in my career. You know, again, I mentioned the CIO that gave the talk when I first came out of college saying, guess what? We're not a technology company. We're a cost center. We're here to support the business. Well, this was a few years ago. I was at another company. Their CIO got up and kind of gave the opposite speech. He said, we are a technology company that happens to be in retail. You know, that's something that at the beginning of my career, you never would have heard anyone in the C-level suite say. And now smart ones are all embracing the fact that we're a technology company. Now, that leads us to automation. Automation is vital to our success in these kinds of environments. You know, if we go back in the day, and I remember one build process that was just a Rube Goldberg machine approach to getting software into production. Most of it was manual. You know, you'd right click in your IDE, and it relied on, you know, hard coded credentials and clear text and a magic drive location, and you'd copy your deliverable out there, and then some job would pick it up, and it was very Rube Goldbergian, and it worked for some definition of worked. You know, it wasn't great. I didn't realize just how fragile it was until I was transitioning off a team, and the amount of work it took for us so that anyone else on my team could do a deploy was staggering to me, because it was all based basically on my ID. It's like, geez, guys, way to think that through. Now, the reason this was, I guess, tolerated is because, well, we don't release very often, so it's not a big deal. Now, I'm a big fan of coffee, and one of the things that I love about my job is it gives me an excuse to go seek out artisanal coffee in all sorts of neat cities. And my team's superpower is we will find the best coffee in a given city. And I love that. It's artisanal coffee is great. I love trying new coffee. And, you know, that's great for coffee. That's not so cool for builds. I can't rely on bespoke builds. Human beings are incapable of doing the same thing twice. If you don't believe me on that, pick up golf as a hobby and get back to me. I was actually playing golf recently, and it's amazing to me how different I am one shot to another. You know, and I think it's amazing that you can do it perfectly one time, and then it's like you've never swung a golf club before. And it's just in the matter of minutes in between those two events. So yeah, human beings, we're not so repeatable. You know, we have bad days. We get tired. We get bored. We skip steps. We fat finger a command. I'm sure several of you saw this email at some point. Integration test email. This template is used by integration tests only. Oops. You know, I'm sure that was a fun day for that HBO engineer who inadvertently sent out the integration test email to some million numbers of subscribers. It happens to all of us. Now, the beauty is, computers don't do that. Computers don't get bored. They don't skip steps. They don't fat finger a command. They just do what you tell them to do until you tell them to stop. Now, I learned a long time ago that in computer science, there's really only three numbers. There's something that only happens 0 times, something that happens 1 and only 1 time, and then n. If you do something more than once, you're going to do it 1 billion times. As much as possible, we want to get into this mantra of anything you do more than once, let's automate it. Let's buff that toil out of the equation. And my friend Venkat had a wonderful tweet about this earlier this summer. Do manually only things that truly give intellectual pleasure, automate away the rest of the work. It's taken my family several months of effort to finally kind of automate almost everything that goes on in terms of sort of like finances and things like that. I don't want to have to spend a lot of time thinking about that. Let's just make that all magically work. The challenge for us when it comes to builds, when it comes to deploys, we need consistency. And the way we get that is CI/CD pipelines. Now, there's a lot of great information out there on CI/CD. We've written some out on our developer center. The wonderful folks at GitHub also have a bunch of great stuff out there on this. And it's important to understand that CI/CD doesn't mean that a developer hits commit and 30 seconds later it's running in production. Now, it can, but to be very clear, no one starts here. So CI has been around a long time. Continuous integration is not something new. This is almost from the beginning of my career. This was kind of the way we did business. And it's just this realization that we don't want to be involved in merging code any more than we have to. So merge early, merge often, so that we have the minimal number of merge conflicts. In other words, avoid merge hell. You know, so some systems tried to solve this with locking. When you check out a file, you locked it so no one else could change it. Of course, the problem here that happened all of the time is someone would check out some code and then they would go on vacation and then you'd have to break the lock, and it's not a lot of fun. So we've evolved now, and we realize that no, the best thing to do is you want to commit early, commit often. And that commit's going to trigger some automated things to happen. Some tests are going to run. There's going to be some code quality scans, et cetera. And what we're trying to do ultimately is make sure that this new commit didn't break some important part of the application. Now that's evolved into CD, continuous delivery, which says, well, let's take that build to the next step. And how do we actually release that into production for our customers? So how do we automate all the way through deployment and release management? I want to stress that it's up to you to decide how often you want to release. Well, not just you, your team, your customer, et cetera. But our goal is to be in a releasable state as often as possible. Now, this does mean we want to work in small batches. Small batch, not just good for bourbon. The advantage of this, frankly, is it lowers the risk. I'm amazed at how risk-averse or corporations so tightly glom on to quarterly releases. Quarterly releases contain hundreds, typically thousands of changes. And I've been involved in plenty of these. And seemingly every time you would do a quarterly release, something would break. And it was never possible to sort of trace it back to one thing, because it's always, well, it's these 3 or 4 or 7 things interacting in a way none of us had anticipated, like, oops. And so then you're sitting there typically very early in the morning or late at night. I guess, the line there is a little blurry. And you're trying to figure out, well, what change caused the break? And the only answer we can legitimately give is we have no idea. It's probably some combination of things. Now, if I'm only pushing a couple of changes and there's a break, I got a pretty good idea where the surface area of that problem lives. It's probably in one of these changes. Now, the other part of this that gets lost in the equation is expertise grows with repetition. If you only release to production a couple of times a year, how can you possibly get good at it? This is something I've talked to my son about almost ad nauseum. If you want to get good at something, you got to do it again and again and again and again and again and again and again, and you'll eventually get good at it. So this is kind of the mantra: deploy early, deploy often. This will encourage you to buff off the rough edges. You'll automate, you'll solve for those problems, and you'll get better at it. You'll get some muscle memory, and you'll also have a lot of trust and faith in that process, because, well, we've done it thousands of times. We know we can do it. We know it works. We have a lot of trust in it. That, by the way, gives us recoverability, which is an important side effect to this. There is no such thing as zero outages. That just is not possible in this world. There will be mistakes. Outages will happen. There will be bugs in code. What we need to focus on is, what's our mean time to recovery? How long does it take us to get that fix up and running? That's where a lot of organizations, they try to pour all this concrete over their process. We're going to make sure no bad thing ever happens. And they spend no time thinking about, well, what should we do when the bad thing happens? We can't just, that can't happen. Well, of course it can. So how do we get that fix into production quickly? Again, it's all about automation. That gives us confidence. I mean, think about the last time you were in your IDE or word processor, you used undo, didn't you? I mean, it's almost a guarantee that you've got, like, Command Z is just like hardwired in. It's just a reflex, but there it is. I don't know how we would work if we didn't have the ability to do undo. Think about writing software without version control. We've all been in that situation where, like, okay, I got it working. I check it in and I start evolving. Oh, no, it's not working. Oh, that's okay. I'll just go back to where I was an hour ago. No big deal. Yeah, I lost an hour, but that's okay. I can recover from that. So we need to have good pipelines. And there's a lot of cool tools here. Use the one that makes sense for you. Most of them are cloud-based now. We're seeing a lot of this built right into our source code management tools as well. GitHub's done a lot of really great work here. Now, it also means we need to think long and hard about our deployment strategies. So back in the day, the deployment strategy was nuke and pave. So we're just going to overlay the current version with the new version. So bye-bye current version, you're gone, hope for the best. And I'm sure it'll all work out. What could possibly go wrong? Well, plenty of things. This typically resulted in some issues, some breaks, a bug or two, some sleepless nights. You guys remember the era of, our application will be down for the next 48 hours for maintenance. We have a maintenance window coming up. That just doesn't fly today. This idea of we're going to be down for 48 hours. How do you say that to a customer? Expectations have changed today. There is no friction in the interwebs. If your application's down, I will go find a competitor's right now and it's going to be up and I'll buy from them instead of you. I actually saw this happen recently. A friend of mine was trying to make a flight arrangements and couldn't get something to work. So he just went to another airline and booked through them. And that was that. So if your site's down, guess what? Your competitors isn't. We just have to realize whether it's convenient or not. We live in this 24/7 world. And if your customer has time at 10 in the morning or 10 o'clock at night, that's when they're going to interact with you. And you better be ready to take their money. This now evolved to sort of the recreate pattern where, okay, we're going to spin down the current version, spin up a new version. And that's good. It's simple, but does mean we have long downtimes, which is not great. So that kind of evolved into rolling updates, which is cool because now we just do a subset of instances, often referred to as a window size. We update those in a block, which is cool because now there's no downtime. But it also means not all my users are on the new version at the same time. That might be an issue. It can be a bit tricky to roll back here. And I also need to think about backwards compatibility. This is also where you start hearing words like sticky affinity and session management. Session management can be a real pain in the cloud environments. Now that eventually kind of evolved or morphed into blue-green deployments. And then this is something that's been around for quite a while now. This was highlighted in the continuous delivery book. And Martin, of course, has talked about it. And it's a pretty standard idea, and by the way, if you haven't read Jez and David's book, I recommend you do. A lot of good stuff in here. We have two identical deployment environments. And so one is currently serving production traffic. We'll call that one blue, although it really doesn't matter. And then we are actively testing the newest version on green. And once everybody says, yep, this looks good, thumbs up, cool, we switch the routing table and now production is pointing at green. Blue is idle. Blue is now our staging environment or a test environment or a QA environment or whatever the heck you want to call it. And if we discover now that we have real production traffic on there, oh no, there's a problem, no worries, just tweak the routing table. We're back at blue. Now, of course, if everything's good to go, no problem. Blue is now my sort of staging environment and I alternate back and forth from there. One of the really interesting unintended side effects of blue-green deploy is I'm basically testing disaster recovery every single time I deploy. That's huge because, again, bad things will and do happen. Now, of course, data is always our tricky part of this equation. So we do need to make sure that schema changes are separated out from application changes. But of course, this does give us zero downtime deploys as well as simpler rollbacks and radically reduces the risk. Now, it is a bit more expensive because I am essentially running two versions of prod at any given time. And of course, backwards compatibility can be a pain here. And I need to think about how am I draining down transactions on current before I cut over. Now, some people are probably saying, well, we don't do blue-green, we do red-black. Okay. I mean, honestly, it's basically the same thing, different colors. Maybe it's a branding exercise. If you like blue gold, go that way. If you like green and gold or purple and gold, or, I don't know. Now I'm just rattling off NFL branding franchises here. Whatever makes you happy. Now, you can make an argument that, well, blue, green can have both versions serving traffic. Red, black says only one version serves traffic. So maybe red, black is a specialization of blue, green. I don't know. It feels like we can have an interesting argument about this, although I'd recommend we do that over a beverage instead of over Zoom. And of course, that leads me to one of my all-time favorite tweets from my old boss who wants to argue about the definition of made-up words with me. Truer words have rarely been spoken, Andrew. I would honestly just say they're similar concepts, different names. Now, some other specialization you'll see here is this idea of a canary release, which says, okay, if it checks out in staging, we're going to go to canary. Now we're going to serve real traffic. This is the canary in the coal mine, but we're going to find out if there's an issue before we unleash all of our prod traffic on it. So this is going to be some percentage, 5, 10, 15, whatever makes us happy. And that can be a sliding scale. We can start at 5, gradually move our way up to 100 if we want. But the moral of the story is the canaries are serving real production traffic. If there's an error, let's do an automated rollback. Now that does lead to a question. Well, how long should I do a canary release? Well, as long as it takes. Could be a couple hours, could be a couple days. Depends an awful lot on the criticality of that shift. It's up to you. Now, there are 3 answers that work for every question you've ever gotten in computer science. There's 42. That's to see who is well read. My favorite response as an architect is another layer of indirection. But the answer I have to give more often than not is, well, it depends. I teach an architecture class in the falls at the University of Minnesota for one of our grad programs. And I told my students on the first day, the answer to most questions that I'm going to ask you this semester is it depends. And boy, they caught onto that real fast. I really do need to have a t-shirt made up that just says it depends. I think my friend Mark has one of those. I got to get in on that. I wish he'd have told me he was doing that. I would have ordered a couple. Now, this does allow us to basically do some testing with real production scenarios without impacting everybody. So this, again, gives us zero downtime, simplifies rollback, but you better have good observability in place. And, this can take a lot of time. Don't forget backwards compatibility. Of course, sticky affinity session management comes into the play as well. Somewhat related to this is the idea of A/B testing. This has become extremely common now in software. There's a lot of really interesting things we can learn by doing real experiments as opposed to just arguing about what we think is going to happen. Let's test it. Let's find out. Let's see what happens when this is actually running in the real world. So you get 2 or more versions of your service running. And these are experiments. And this is really an opportunity for us to test out our ideas. And so basically what's going to happen here is some percentage of our users are going to get the experiment and some aren't. And this is going to give us real data. We can do compare and contrast. And now instead of, again, us arguing, we can say, well, we did this and we saw this change to orders or to conversions or signups or whatever it is that we care about. But you better have good observability in place. And it is possible to break the application. Now, of course, these techniques can be combined. You can do a rolling blue-green, you can do canary blue-green, and mix and match to your heart's content, which of course leads to the question of which approach is right for you. I think you know what I'm going to say next. It depends. Do what's right for you. Do what's right for your situation. Different apps are going to have different needs. Doesn't matter what approach you take. You're going to need automation, and then you're going to need to automate some more, and then keep automating until everything's automated. Now, if you're not sure how to convince people to do this, you might want to drop information around the office about Night Capital. So this is one of the few times you're ever going to see in an SEC filing, that's a U.S. organization that oversees the financial markets, essentially, where they actually talk about software. It's fascinating. And it's actually a pretty good read, more or less. I mean, if anything that can come out of a economics area can be interesting to read. And basically, this is zombie software is the best way to think about it. And so what they did in this scenario is they had repurposed an old flag. They did a rolling deployment, except the operator missed one of the servers. So 7 servers had the new code, 1 didn't. Turns out this is not fine. They lost $460 million, 75% of their market value in a matter of hours. A week later, they were acquired. The lesson? Well, your releases need to be reliable. They need to be repeatable. Don't ever rely on a human being to do things perfectly. They can't, they won't, they will make a mistake, they will fat finger, they will get bored, they will skip a step. Automation is your friend. Automation is what allows you to get a good night's sleep. This is yet another example of what people refer to as shift left. We want to find issues when they're the easiest to fix. It turns out once you take the cake out of the oven, it's really hard to change the recipe. So we want to try to make sure as many of these problems are fixed as early in the process as we possibly can. So if you're not sure how to create a pipeline, my friends on the Spring team have some thoughts. Now, we're not trying to own your build. This is just an opinionated place basically to start, automate away to your heart's content. This is really why we keep referring to something as code. Everything today is X as code, infrastructure as code, configuration as code. And really what I'd say we're doing here is, again, part of that culture shift, building bridges to different organizations, knocking down these walls, instead of just throwing over the wall at operations. It's this notion that, all right, we're going to make this more of a self-serve model, which is great in terms of responsiveness. Because in the day, we used to have to make a whole bunch of decisions really, really early on in the process when we knew the least. So a very typical question that I would get asked at the beginning of a project is, all right, Nate, how much capacity is your new application going to need? And I just kind of shrug. And in my infrastructure, people would say, I can't do that. You got to give me something. And so I'd do a little back of the envelope scribbling, and I'd take my worst case scenario, or what I thought my worst case scenario was, and I'd double it and throw another 25% on. Oh, you know what? Let's double it again. And, just in case, right? Because it takes so darn long to get these things. And it's so much time of me filling out tickets and going to meetings and emailing people and calling people and following. It's enough to make you want to flip a table. Incidentally, my wife saw this slide and she stared at it and she said, "What is that?" And I said, "Well, it's table flip. See, arms up in the air, table up in the air." And she just kind of looked at me and said, "You have a weird job." And I said, "You're not wrong. I actually have table flip as a keyboard expansion on my system. So I just type in a couple letters and bloop, out comes this little dude. So back in the day, it was in my best interest to heavily over allocate resources. Better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. It's really hard to get capacity added later. Now that gave us single resource or single digit resource utilization, not awesome. And so cloud allows us to kind of get away from some of that. Because again, I can scale up, I can scale down, I can do that on demand. I do have that limitless compute modulo the fact that there are additional fees that may apply. And again, those fees are definitely very opaque. And so I need to understand that that's kind of the cost of the democratization of this particular sort of piece. Now, we just didn't have to think about that in the past. Our handlers did. Our operators handled it for us. And so we now live in this paradox of choice, which, by the way, is a fantastic book and a decent TEDx video as well. Democratization demands more of all of us. And so to paraphrase some of the founding fathers of the US, a well-informed developer is a prerequisite to successful cloud. Now, this is another cultural question we have to ask ourselves is what do we want our developers focusing their time on? You know, one of my friends was telling me that, you know, he was talking to a client and basically said to him, listen, with this approach, your developers need to be certified in their application framework of choice. They also need to be experts on their cloud provider. Oh, and they also need to be experts on the container orchestrator. Do you really want them worried about all that, or do you want them solving business problems? So we need to be prepared. We need to be aware. We also need to be very careful what we wish for. Because, yeah, we have more control, but we also have more accountability. So never forget Uncle Ben's wise words. With great power comes great responsibility. I think that's what gets lost in a lot of these conversations is we just kind of get so locked into all of the self-serve and the positives. And we're like, oh, this is amazing. I love it. And then we kind of forget about the additional work or scrutiny that this forces upon us. And that's a pretty important part of the equation, you know, and it's, again, so easy to kind of lose sight of that. Now, it should be pretty obvious that this can be really overwhelming, especially to an engineering organization. And a lot of folks, this is where you have to understand a little bit how human beings work. This can trigger the lizard brain. When we put a whole lot of change on top of somebody, it can really kind of overclock you a bit. Years ago, when I was in grad school, one of my friends and I were chatting one day, and I realized that in the course of the first 9 months of our program, he'd basically gone through most major life change events. So he'd started a grad program, he'd changed jobs, he was welcoming his first child into the world, and his wife moved. And I thought, my gosh, you know, my friend, if you would only just have a relative die and get a divorce, you could basically have every life change event happen in 1 9-month period. And you could just see how much of a toll that was taking on him. And we need to remember that the technology can do that to people too. And you trigger the lizard brain and people just go, change bad, and they push back aggressively. We need to channel some empathy. We need to channel some compassion. And we need to think about how do we approach someone when they're new to this idea. Now, I didn't always appreciate this. Many years ago, I was at our company picnic and I was chatting with one of my friends and I said, hey, Al, how's it going? And she just kind of shook her head and said, Nate, I'm on one of those agile projects. And as a fan of agile development, I just sort of kind of rolled my eyes and I'm like, you know, okay, waterfaller. And I took a step back though, and I thought, all right, well, hang on. How have we approached Al about these kinds of things? Now, Althea has been delivering code to production for years and years and years. She's a very successful engineer. And someone like me comes along and says, you know, Al, the way you've been doing it your whole career is wrong. I've got the right answer. And here it is. It's agile development. No one's ever done anything like this before. We're right. You're wrong. And if you don't choose to do it our way, you're just an idiot. Well, that's not a great way to convince somebody to come over to your side of the fence, is it? We have to remember that any technology change, any adoption of a new technology is a journey. And one of the challenges for those of us that are trying to evangelize or trying to get the adoption spread is we have to remember that a new person is where we used to be. Years and years ago, I was a very happy Subversion user. And so when Git came around, I'm like, I don't need another version control tool. I'm pretty good where I am. And one of my friends is like, oh, dude, you totally have to watch this Google video on it. It's amazing. And so one rainy Saturday, I had an hour. And so I watched this video and I was mostly pretty offended because for an hour, The person was just saying, Git's amazing. If you're not using my shell scripts, you're an idiot. Any other source code management tool is only used by children and people who don't know better and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, wow, I'm actually kind of offended. And so I didn't really think much more about Git for, I don't know, a couple of years. Then I attended a presentation a friend of mine did on Git, and I was blown away by what Git could do. And I saw another presentation on Git, and once again, blown away by what Git could do. And so fast forward now, and I'm like, you'll take Git from my cold dead hands. Like, how else can you do source code management? And so I have to remember that if I encounter somebody today who's new to Git, which is harder and harder to find, by the way, I have to remember they're where I used to be. So if we got an organization that's new to the cloud, well, they're where we used to be as well. And I can't wave a magic wand and get them to where I am, but you know what? I can help them along the way. I know where the potholes are. And so I can help them walk that path more easily. I can maybe help them avoid some of those issues. I might be able to get them there faster, but they still have to walk that path. And that's some of these things they just have to do for themselves. Now, one of the things that I've done that seems to help an awful lot in these scenarios is have these day in the life conversations with people. And so I've had some folks who are just adamantly against cloud. And they're like, this is no, we have to own this. There's no way we can do this. Won't work. And they always come up with these excuses. And a lot of what it is ultimately is that lizard brain reacting and change bad. And so when I have a chat with them, I said, well, tell me what you do today. Give me an idea what a day in the life of you is like. And then I map that to what their day is going to look like in the future. And yeah, some of the tools are going to change for sure. But what's often going to happen is I'm going to eliminate some of the things they hate to do. And I'm going to give them some higher value things to work on, some more interesting problems to work on. And if I approach this conversation with empathy and with compassion, it tends to work out very well. And I've seen in a lot of situations, once you give people a chance to express their feelings a bit and you tell them what's really going on, you're honest with them about what's happening, a lot of times those people turn into your greatest advocates. So yeah, your culture will change. It will evolve, but you have to be patient. And it's hard. I'm not a patient person. And I love this tweet from Alan, change is a process. It's not a destination. He's absolutely right. So you have to be kind of ready for the long haul here. You got to practice some positive reinforcement. Hey, great job on this. I'm really glad to see what you did there. Hey, can you talk about your experience here? And yeah, you're going to need some guardrails in place to do this. It can't just be a free for all. And we do need to focus on paved roads. This is another part of the equation that some people look at this and they're like, oh my God, it's a free for all. I can do whatever I want. I finally have an excuse to use insert esoteric technology here. Well, yeah, that's part of the autonomy, but you know what? There's also accountability that comes along with it. You make a bad technology choice, you should be ready for kind of a tough conversation at some point there. But honestly, even the organizations with the most sort of baked in developer autonomy, they focus on paved roads. Here's a well-worn path. We know it works. We know how to support it. If you choose to go on a minimum maintenance road, like good luck to you. I hope everything works out for you. But you know what? At the end of the day, you build it. You own it. Hope you brought your snow chains. By the way, you build it, you run it. So are you ready for that? Are you ready for the fact that your systems are going to fail? I mean, because they're gonna. We can't prevent all bad things from happening, but we need to be prepared for it. We need to understand that your resources aren't going to scale to infinity. There will be competition for hardware, for staff, priorities. This is another one of those interesting cultural bits. A lot of organizations, for better or worse, the bigger your headcount, the more important you are. So never underestimate the battle for headcount. Every manager I've ever talked to could use another engineer or 10 or 20. Every VP I've ever talked to said their portfolio is the most important in the company and should get the lion's share of the budget. No one ever says, oh yeah, you could cut our budget. It's not going to matter. We don't really do anything important around here. Who could have possibly predicted this? Again, I wish I had a magic solution or recipe, a template. It's hard. And I hope what I've been able to get across to you here in the last hour is that you have to think about the cultural implications of any technology change that you make. If we just focus solely on the technology and forget about the people, I can pretty much guarantee you're going to fail. So we have to think about how this impacts others. We have to have these conversations. We also need to be patient, and I'm not good at that, but I wish you luck. I hope this was useful to you. We'll be around here for some Q&A, but I guess with that, I will go ahead and stop my slides. And then I think we slide over to another Zoom room if memory serves.
Yeah, that was pretty much like perfect timing. I think that's your German roots that we talked about. So you totally hit it from the timer perspective. And yes, I also really love what you said about, well, both good coffee. So I'm another crazy coffee person here. And also more technically what you said about automation. And I think there are a lot of really good lessons here. And yes, so I also thought of some questions. And for folks who want to join us, then now please join us in the Q&A room. And yes, Nate, thanks, a big thanks already for you and this wonderful presentation. And thanks to everybody for joining.